He promised to stick to his term limits as president, but a referendum is underway that could lead to Egyptian leader Abdel-Fattah El-Sisi's stay in office being extended, and he could also be granted unprecedented powers. So, is Egypt headed towards a complete authoritarian rule, and what are the consequences both at home and in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. Millions of Egyptians are headed to the polls to vote on a constitutional referendum that could keep President Abdel-Fattah El-Sisi in power until 2030. The move has received overwhelming backing from Parliament. Supporters say Sisi has stabilized Egypt and needs more time to finalize economic reform. If passed, the president would be able to appoint top judges, expand the role of the military, and create a post of vice president. But rights groups are concerned Sisi's consolidation of power will lead to a crackdown on dissent. There is a lot to unpack here. We'll begin with a report from Al Jazeera's Hashim Al-Habara to see just what's at stake.
President Abdel-Fattah El-Sisi was sworn in last year after winning his second term in office. The vote was marred by claims of irregularities, a crackdown on activists and potential challengers. A few months earlier, Sisi had said he would not seek a third term, but the Egyptian leader seems to have changed his mind. Beginning on Saturday, voters will take part in a referendum that could extend Sisi's term in office by 2 years and allow him to stand for another 6-year mandate, effectively keeping him in office until 2030. The move is a departure from the 2011 constitutional declaration that limits presidents to 2 4-year terms.
Egypt has completely eliminated opposition. It's an environment of repression and fear. People are terrified to vote, to express dissent. Just in the lead up to this vote, more than 120 people have been arrested for campaigning for the no vote.
Sisi rose to prominence after the 2011 uprising. In 2012, he was appointed Minister of Defense by Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohammed Morsi. A year later, Sisi deposed Morsi in a military coup and eventually became president while consolidating his grip on power. His government has arrested thousands of activists and opponents, many facing death penalties. The trials were widely condemned by human rights groups as a travesty. Over the last few years, a predominantly loyal parliament has introduced a series of reforms expanding the military's influence. The referendum is also asking people to vote for a provision that declares the military the guardian and protector of the state. The opposition is calling for boycott.
Our dream and hope to have a president who's elected once every 2 terms has come to an end.
But Sisi's rule is not without challenges. He faces armed groups in the Sinai Peninsula who have launched attacks against security forces and international calls for political reforms. But the general turned politician seems defiant. He's launching mega projects across the country and hoping to be able to fix an economy in tatters and win the trust of the people. Hashim Al-Habara, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in the panel. Joining us from Cairo on Skype is Timothy Kaldas, non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. From London, Maha Azzam, head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. And again on Skype from Tunis, Hussein Bahami, Egypt researcher for Amnesty International. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. Let's talk. I'm going to start with you, Timothy. What do you expect voter turnout to be in this referendum?
I don't think that the numbers will be very substantial. There were some lines outside some polling stations before they opened this morning. And there are some rumors and reports circulating now that people are being given food to go and cast a ballot. But overall, I think that most Egyptians take this as a done deal. And so there isn't really much concern about participating in the outcome. Some opposition groups have been encouraging voting no, and people have been responding to that, but it's still not on the scale that would, I think, tilt turnout dramatically.
Maha, do you agree with that assessment and that maybe voters, do they feel like they even actually have a say?
Not at all. I think experience shows that the vote means nothing under General Sisi since 2013. We had presidential elections, so-called presidential elections in March 2018, and 4 years prior to that. And each time the voter turnout was extremely low, and there is no transparency. There is no way of knowing whether the votes have been rigged or people's voices have been taken into account. Votes are rigged for all we know. Last time Sisi won by so-called 97%. This is the stuff of dictatorships, and people know full well that under the rule of this general, that the voice and the vote means nothing. So I believe the voter turnout will be extremely low. And if we're told it's not, it's because, again, the media is playing to the tune of the military regime.
Hussein, a similar question to you. Before we get into, the nuts and bolts of what this referendum actually would do, what are the concerns of Amnesty International about the vote itself in Egypt?
So we are concerned with the process because it is happening during the worst crackdown on freedom of expression in Egypt in recent history. We are talking about a time where people are being arrested for voicing their opinions on extremely non-political matters. We are talking about time where women are being arrested just for sharing their frustration with rampant sexual harassment in Egypt. We're talking about time of young people being arrested for supporting a football club. We're talking about a time where there is absolutely no acceptable form of expression that is not sanctioned by the state. We're also talking about time where protests are dealt with extremely heavy-handed. We're talking about time where people can be sentenced to 5 years, or in some cases 25 years, or even to death for participating in protests. So our concern is that this is happening, the vote's happening in a time where there is unprecedented crackdown and restrictions of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association.
And we've also seen reports saying that there are literally thousands of domains on the internet that have been blocked as well. Is there any type of outlet for dissent at all?
There isn't an easy outlet for voicing dissent. So the streets are closed. All forms of written and TV and radio media that are available to most Egyptians are controlled by the state one way or another. The state has been cracking down on online spaces step by step. Of course, the opposition have been developing different tools to communicate. And they will continue to develop these tools to circumvent censorship, but the state is also applying huge amounts of resources that could go to solving many of Egypt's economic or social problems into controlling and restricting online media, or what remains of online media in Egypt now.
Timothy, so along the way, like the steps that this referendum had to take to get to the public, there were 22 members of parliament who voted against it. That's it. Do you have a feel for if there are more members of parliament that really are opposed to it but don't feel that they could vote that way?
Undoubtedly, there probably are amongst the 531 that voted for it, some that personally would prefer that it not go forward. But keep in mind that most of the people who are in parliament have been brought in as state loyalists, have been brought in to participate in the patronage networks of the regime. It's not a serious political institution with a lot of politically aware membership or seriously politically engaged membership. There are a handful of active parliamentarians, and we saw some of that in the articulation of opposition to this amendment. But for the most part, this is not really an institution that is actually that political, despite its formal constitutional role.
So even people that supported Sisi at first, do you think that this is the turn that they anticipated?
I think that if we're going back to people who supported Sisi in 2013, there's been years increasing levels of disillusionment with him. There were people who believed that he wouldn't run for president, of course, and he said that he wouldn't, but he did. There are people that believe that he wouldn't amend the Constitution to extend his time in office, and he is about to. There's a continual kind of sense of disappointment amongst certain sections of his supporters. Some are still diehard, of course. But also what's probably done the most to damage his popularity is not even the political issues, but actually the economic situation. The purchasing power of Egyptians has collapsed as the pound's value has collapsed, particularly since 2016. The removal of a lot of subsidies has increased the cost of living dramatically as well. So people are under enormous economic pressure, and they're not seeing any sort of relief up until this point. And so I think that's really actually done more than the political crackdown to damage his reputation and his support.
Okay, so let's pick up on that economic point, Maha. So it may be damaging his popularity to a certain extent, but might that also be the recipe for a leader who wants to take more power to try to say, I can fix this, give me more time? Is that something that would resonate with a population that says, yes, we actually want our leader to have even more power?
The story that's being sold to Egyptians, the narrative that's being set out by the media propaganda machine of the regime is, yes, he needs more time, he can provide security and stability, and the story that's being sold to the West that he's the best guardian of Egypt's security and the fight against terrorism. But in reality, since 2013, Egyptians have seen enough of the regime to realize he's been there in power for long enough for them to realize that the economic situation is deteriorating for the vast majority of Egyptians. The cut in subsidies is biting very hard. Unemployment is high, and so is inflation. The Egyptian pound is worthless. But above all, I believe we have a military economic empire. We have deep-seated corruption. So whatever the numbers may look like over the next couple of years, and the economic picture that Sisi will try to project is not the reality in terms of the vast majority of Egyptians. They are poor, they feel even poorer under his regime, and they know that corruption is rife, and the military runs over 60% of the economy, and that corruption is at the heart of it. They survive, this regime survives through corruption, as did the Mubarak regime, but now it is even more brutal than any military regime before it, and Egyptians are feeling the crunch economically, but they also know that they're living in a republic of fear. So the combination is lethal and very, very difficult for the Egyptian citizens.
Timothy, I saw a reaction on your face. Did you want to say something to what Maha was saying?
Look, to a large extent, I agree with much of what she said, but just the claim that the military owns 60% of the economy of Egypt is really untenable. There's no evidence to support something of that scale. And just due to the expansion and diversification of the Egyptian economy over the last 20, 30 years, it's more or less impossible for them to have that kind of control over it. There's just really no math that would add up for that. And so that's all.
Okay. Hussein, let me ask you something. You talked about a lot of things that have been happening in Egypt for a while when it comes to rights and rights changing. When did that first start to really concern Amnesty? And do you think that any world power, perhaps obviously the U.S., maybe could have put some sort of pressure on Egypt to shed a light on these types of things? Could that or would that have made a difference?
Well, we have been concerned with the situation of human rights in Egypt since decades, really. I mean, some of the issues that we are talking about are systematic and have been inherent in the Egyptian, for example, unfair trials in Egypt has been a disease for decades now. Torture has been rife for decades. But what's happening more recently is that because of international silence over much of what has been happening in Egypt, we are seeing multiplication of what has been of these practices. So, for example, if you were talking about 100 or 1,000 cases of torture during Mubarak's times, and we're talking about much larger number now. Enforced disappearances used to happen too, but not on that scale. They were not the norm. What we are seeing now is that the exceptional is becoming the norm. So unfair trials that would affect some people or not a relatively large group during Mubarak. Now we are seeing that they're affecting thousands or tens of thousands. We are seeing that under President Sisi, Egypt is moving towards constitutionalizing and institutionalizing a number of legislations and amendments in the constitution that actually make the exceptions the norms. For example, with these recent amendments, expanding the military trials for civilians to be included in not only be included in the constitution as was seen earlier, but actually to affect now you can be trialed in front of a military court for something as simple as having a fight in a court that's owned by the military or being on a public property that is under protection of the military. So now we are seeing that the situation, like human rights violations, are like multiplying, and the silence of the international community to a large degree have facilitated this to continue.
Maha, I want to talk to you about that, about this blurred line between the military and civilians. So part of what would become law, should this referendum pass, is the military is supposed to oversee the civilian nature of the country. What does that mean?
I think we're already seeing that. What we're seeing through this referendum and the constitutional amendments is a codification of a reality that already exists, that the military does have control. It's going to extend that control over the judiciary, over appointments, and the appointments already are under some kind of influence from the military, but it will be codified. The military will have the right to decide or to veto the choice of a defense minister, to choose the prosecutor general. It extends its power in every field. It allows for more military trials. And I think it also, and I want to go back to this economic issue, the military does have a stranglehold on the economy. And even part of the amendments is to ensure that deals or trade deals between governments and institutions and outside parties come under the supervision of the military. The military is an economic empire. This is why they also don't want to let go. Power and money are combined. There are very real interests at play here. And the military, through these constitutional amendments, will have a greater hold on Egypt's politics, its judiciary, and its economy. This bodes very ill for the independence of all Egyptian institutions that have already been undermined since 2013, but now there is a greater codification and attempt at legitimizing this process. And of course, it has no legitimacy whatsoever.
So Timothy, people very rarely give up power voluntarily, right? And when you look at authoritarian regimes, it may seem that you can say, well, you know what, at least this means, you know, some sort of stability for an extended period of time. But these things rarely end well. Why is that? There's always these huge collapses of these systems. Why is that?
Well, fundamentally, authoritarian systems, particularly ones that don't develop any sort of institutions, collapse like a house of cards because they haven't built up a more effective diffusion of power that can sustain itself beyond the collapse of the key characters, right? So when Mubarak was overthrown, there was a lot of political turmoil. When Gaddafi was overthrown, we saw the turmoil in Libya. If you look at any of these countries, this formula of political organization is fundamentally unstable. And these regimes, because they see themselves constantly as fragile, overreact oftentimes and encourage the production of authoritarian systems, not only domestically, but in their region, as we see with the Emirates, as we see with Saudi Arabia, that has been pushing for supporting authoritarians throughout the Middle East. And so you have this situation in which there's a proclivity for using violence There's a lack of a sort of effective succession plan or any sort of mechanism that is viable and credible for the peaceful transition of power. And so invariably, the only way to actually get effective change for a population is to force it. And of course, that process can often be quite chaotic and even violent. But it's really not a product of the protesters themselves, but rather of the system of the violent authoritarians who have created this dynamic within their societies.
Hussein, what concern does Amnesty International have for the impact that this type of referendum, these type of changes could mean for the region?
So we are worried about how the codification of the practices violating violating the right to fair trial, codifying the influence of the executive over the judicial branch for a very long time, because the changes that are going to happen to the constitution are going to be there for a long time. But then when it comes to the region, we are worried, because if you look at Libya, for example, with Haftar specifically, he is clearly, he has been fascinated with the model that President Abdel-Fattah El-Sisi has been implementing in Egypt, and Egypt has been supporting Haftar for a long time. So
and now
we are
President
worried
Donald
that
Trump has also seems to have thrown his support behind Haftar as well. He has a good relationship with Sisi. So I just wanted to make sure our viewers were aware of that as you mentioned those names.
Yeah, so this is very worrying, because now this model of extreme repressive authoritarianism and the rule of effectively, to a large degree, by security agencies, not just the military, but also the police. If this spreads to Libya, you never know what would happen, especially that you have two other countries that are undergoing changes at the moment, and the results are not very clear. So we are very much worried, like I'm referring to Algeria and Sudan, just to clarify, but we are very much worried that this model of repression, that's not only policies and legislations, but being codified in the constitution to be imported into other countries in the region, like Libya, Algeria, or Sudan.
Maha, how does this compare to the time of Hosni Mubarak?
I think it's a more extreme version of dictatorship. It's a dictatorship that also feels greatly threatened. I think post-2011, many of the regimes in the region realized that people could rise up and could bring down the dictator. So the comeback through a military coup in 2013 was a means by which the military could hold on and the old regime once more. And much of the message of Sisi and his supporters is that never again. We will not allow what happened on January the 25th, 2011 to happen again. We will not allow the electoral process that was underway in 2012 and put forward the first democratically elected president for Egypt to happen again. So they see themselves as a bulwark against any kind of populist uprising that would bring about democracy to the people in Egypt or to the region. And therefore, he's holding on very tight, and he's as repressive as ever, more so than even under Mubarak. But I think he feels he needs to be like this because there has been an uprising, and he wants to ensure there isn't one in the future. But of course, the continuing repression, the continuing economic failure for the majority of Egyptians will mean, I think, that sooner or later there will be a backlash. And I believe that opposition to the military regime in Egypt is stronger than it ever has been over the last few decades.
Okay, that will be our final word. I'm sure we will revisit this topic in the coming days and weeks. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion very much. We appreciate it. Timothy Kaldas in Cairo and London, Maha Azzam and Hussein Bouami in Tunis. Thank you. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime. Visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.